Elizabeth wasn't snooping. She was simply looking for the good tape, the one strong enough to fix the wobbly garden hose nozzle, when she opened the bottom drawer of her husband's work desk. What she found instead was a stack of neatly rolled architectural blueprints secured with a rubber band. Her name wasn't on them. Curious, she unrolled the largest sheet, spreading it across the table. It was their house. Or it used to be. The kitchen wall was gone, replaced by a wide-open lounge labeled community space. Her art studio upstairs had been converted into multi-use activity room. The backyard garden was now a shared outdoor wellness zone. Her pulse quickened. On the side of the paper, scrawled in her husband's unmistakably careful handwriting, were the words, "The Grey Nest, Phase 1. Elizabeth stared, heart hammering. Their home, her sanctuary of 35 years, was being turned into some sort of senior center? She didn't even hear Harold walk in behind her. "Oh," he said softly, "you found it." She turned slowly. "You were going to knock out the kitchen wall?" "I was going to talk to you," he replied, holding his hands up. "I just hadn't figured out how yet." Elizabeth picked up another sheet, this one showing the ground floor completely restructured. "And this?" she asked. "The lounge? The reception desk? Harold, what is this?" He looked down, then back at her. "It's something I've been thinking about for a long time," he said. "This house, it's too big for just the two of us. And every time I walk the neighborhood, I see our friends growing older, more isolated. I thought, what if this place could mean something again? Not just for us, but for them." Elizabeth didn't speak. Not because she didn't have words, but because she had too many. She looked at the blueprints again, at the living room where their daughter had taken her prom photos, the back deck where her late mother had once sipped tea every afternoon, the wall where she'd hung her retirement portrait from the firm. Memories lived in every corner of this place, and Harold wanted to erase them. She rolled up the plans tighter than necessary and set them back down. "You should have told me," she said, voice calm but brittle. "I know," he replied. She nodded once, then walked out of the room, and as she climbed the stairs, every creak of the floorboard beneath her feet felt heavier than it had in years. Elizabeth didn't speak to Harold the rest of that evening. She made dinner in silence, scraping the chopping board harder than usual. He tried to help, but she waved him off without a word. At the table, they sat across from each other like strangers, him gently stirring his soup, her pretending not to notice the blueprints still resting on the counter. By bedtime, she was exhausted, but not from the day, from the ache of disappointment. Lying awake in the dark, she stared at the ceiling, her mind looping through the same thought. How long had he been planning this? Their home wasn't just square footage. It was a scrapbook made of walls, floors, and light. Every corner whispered a memory. How could Harold, of all people, want to gut it like a fixer-upper? The next morning, he didn't bring her coffee like usual. That stung more than it should have. Around noon, Elizabeth found herself in the garage, staring at the dusty plastic bins they hadn't opened since their daughter moved out. She knelt down and opened one, revealing photo albums, old report cards, scribbled Mother's Day cards in crayon. She sat on the cold concrete floor, flipping through a faded album labeled Year 11, Emily's Dance Recital. There was their daughter in a purple tutu, arms stretched wide in the exact corner of the living room that Harold had labeled lounge area. Elizabeth closed the album. She wasn't ready to lose this house. Later that day, Harold appeared in the doorway of her studio, holding 2 mugs. "Peace offering," he said, offering her the one with the chipped ceramic heart. She took it. Warm, familiar. They sat for a moment in silence. "I know I handled this wrong," he said quietly. "I should have come to you first." Elizabeth looked at him, her voice low. "You didn't just make plans without me, Harold. You made plans about me, about our home, our life. I didn't mean to hurt you, but you did." He nodded, swallowing hard. "I just thought, you've been restless lately. Ever since you left the firm, I thought maybe this could be a new chapter. For both of us." She looked away. "Restless doesn't mean rootless," she murmured. "I know." A long pause stretched between them. Then he added, "Would you come with me tomorrow? There's a community center I've been visiting. I want you to see it. Just see what I've seen." Elizabeth hesitated. Part of her wanted to say no, to cling to the principle of it all, to protect what was hers. But another part, smaller, Quieter, but insistent, was curious, so she nodded. "All right," she said. "One visit." Harold smiled but didn't push further. That night, as she turned off the lights downstairs, Elizabeth paused by the living room window. Outside, an elderly neighbor was sitting alone on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the street. Elizabeth watched her for a long time. Then, without quite knowing why, she whispered to the darkened glass, "What if Harold's not wrong?" The next morning arrived with gray skies and the kind of quiet that made everything feel fragile. Elizabeth dressed simply, jeans, a light sweater, no makeup. She told herself she wasn't trying to impress anyone. This wasn't about appearances. It was about information, observation. One visit, nothing more. Harold didn't say much during the drive. He let the radio play soft jazz while they passed familiar streets, now slowly aging, like the people who had lived on them for decades. They arrived at the community center, a modest one-story building tucked between a pharmacy and a shuttered laundromat. The parking lot was cracked, and the welcome sign was faded from too many years under the sun. Inside, the lights flickered with a cold glow. Elizabeth smelled a mixture of old linoleum and overbrewed coffee. She crossed her arms, taking it in with the trained eye of someone who had once designed spaces meant to breathe, not just stand. A staff member greeted them, a kind woman named Darlene, probably in her 70s, with tired eyes and a practiced smile. "We're glad to have you. Most of the folks are in the rec room for morning chair yoga." Elizabeth followed Harold down a hallway with peeling paint and dusty corkboards filled with long-forgotten flyers. The room they entered was filled with people, some in wheelchairs, some with walkers, most just sitting. A woman in bright leggings led gentle stretches while soft music played. Elizabeth scanned the room. No one was talking. No laughter, no conversations, just motion. Mechanical. Slow. Necessary. At the back of the room, a man in his 80s was staring blankly out the window while mimicking the stretch. His hands shook slightly. No one noticed. Darlene leaned toward Elizabeth. "We do our best, but the budget is tight. There's not enough space, not enough programs. Most of these folks only come here once a week. It's better than nothing, but barely." After the session ended, Elizabeth lingered by a table where a few people were piecing together a puzzle. An elderly woman looked up. "Are you new?" she asked with a hopeful smile. "Just visiting," Elizabeth said. The woman's smile dimmed. "Shame. We could use new faces." Later, on the ride home, Harold didn't speak. He let Elizabeth sit with her thoughts. She finally broke the silence. "That place was awful," she said. Harold glanced at her. "But not because of the people," she continued, "because it felt forgotten." He nodded slowly. "That's why I wanted something better. Something that feels like a home. Something ours." She looked out the window. For the first time, she imagined their living room not as a loss, but as a beginning. Not a sacrifice, but a transformation. Still, something in her resisted. "It's not that I don't want to help," she said quietly. "It's that I've spent my whole life building things for other people. This house, it was the one thing I built for us, for me, and now you're asking me to give that up." Harold took a deep breath. "I'm asking you to help build something that lasts beyond us." That night, Elizabeth sat alone in her old studio. She pulled open a drawer and found her sketchbook. Buried under books, old receipts, scraps of paper with forgotten ideas. She flipped through the pages. Blank. Then older sketches. Then blank again, until one blank page remained. She placed it on her desk, picked up a pencil, and slowly drew the outline of their house. Not as it was, but as it could be. Open. Breathing. Shared. Elizabeth didn't tell Harold about the sketch, not yet. She wasn't even sure she was going to show it to him. The drawing wasn't a decision, it was a whisper. A tentative what if. But something had shifted in her, and she couldn't ignore it. For the next few days, she spent hours in her studio. At first, just tracing shapes, playing with light and flow. But as she let herself imagine, her lines grew bolder. The kitchen opened into a communal table space, with built-in shelves for shared cookbooks and old recipes. The sunroom transformed into a reading lounge with large windows and soft chairs. "A place to sit without the world rushing you," she wrote in the margins. She designed a side entrance with a ramp that curved like a gentle invitation. Not institutional. Welcoming. Organic. The upstairs hallway, once quiet and unused since Emily had moved out, became a row of memory nooks. Small spaces with warm lighting where people could sit and bring something that mattered, a photo, a letter, a piece of their story. She called that section the Archive of Living. One afternoon, she caught herself humming. That startled her more than anything. It had been months, years, since design had made her feel light, not pressured, not obligated, just alive. That evening, she sat across from Harold at dinner. He was reading something on his tablet. She reached into her bag, pulled out the rolled sketch, and slid it across the table. He looked at her, surprised. "You redesigned it." "I adapted it," she said. He opened it, unrolling the page slowly. As he studied the layout, his eyes filled, not with tears, but something older and deeper. Recognition, gratitude, awe. "This is incredible," he whispered. Elizabeth shrugged. "It's not done. I still need to figure out zoning, and we'll need city approval if we want to use the outdoor space." He looked up. "Does this mean?" "It means," she said, "if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, together. And this time you make the coffee while I handle the permits." He laughed, a short, stunned sound. Elizabeth smiled. "Also," she added, "we're keeping the wisteria by the back porch. Non-negotiable." Harold nodded quickly. "Of course, wouldn't dare." The next day, they sat side by side at the dining table, turning her sketch into a plan. Harold called their contractor friend, while Elizabeth emailed the local council for guidelines. They talked about flooring options, insulation, and soundproofing. They debated paint colors, laughed over the merits of bamboo versus reclaimed oak. But beneath every detail, something else was building, a partnership, not just of marriage but of purpose. Word started to spread. A few neighbors stopped by, curious. One offered to donate art supplies. Another said her retired husband would love to teach a chess group. Someone else mentioned a friend who played piano and missed performing. Within a week, Elizabeth had a waiting list of people wanting to be involved. They didn't even know what the place would be called yet. But the idea? It was breathing. She stood one morning at the edge of the backyard, blueprint in hand, staring at the big oak tree that had stood longer than she and Harold had lived there. It would remain, not just for its roots, but for the shade it gave, generous and wide. A lot like the home she was learning to rebuild. Not just in walls, but in spirit. The momentum was building faster than Elizabeth expected. What began as a sketch had evolved into blueprints, permit applications, and a growing team of eager neighbors. Some days, it felt like the house had come alive again. Its quiet corners filled with voices, ideas, laughter, and the occasional argument over whether to serve herbal tea or full caffeine coffee in the future community cafe. But with momentum came friction. It started with a phone call from Emily, their daughter. Elizabeth had emailed her the new plans, proudly, hesitantly, and expected at least a glimmer of enthusiasm. Instead, she got silence. Then a brief text. "We need to talk." When Elizabeth picked up the phone that evening, Emily didn't waste time. "You're really turning the house into a public space?" Elizabeth took a breath. "It's still our home, but yes, we're opening parts of it to the community." There was a pause. Then Emily's voice tight and confused. "That's the house I grew up in, Mom. You're just giving it away?" "No," Elizabeth said gently. "We're sharing it. It won't be the same. It hasn't been the same for years." Another silence. Then, quietly, "I thought maybe someday I'd bring my kids there. If I ever had them, I thought it would still feel like mine." Elizabeth felt the ache press behind her ribs. She had braced for zoning hurdles and budgeting headaches. But not this. Not the grief in her daughter's voice. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you'll always have a place here, no matter what changes. And I promise, we're keeping what matters." Emily didn't respond right away, but when she did, her voice was softer. "Just don't erase everything." "I won't," Elizabeth promised. "I know what this place means. That's why I want it to mean something to more people, too." They ended the call in a fragile peace. But the pushback wasn't only from family. Some neighbors who'd initially shown polite interest now expressed concern. One man across the street sent an email warning that the project might disturb the character of the neighborhood. Another woman stopped Elizabeth at the mailbox and said, with a smile too sharp to be kind, "I just hope it doesn't bring in, the wrong kind of crowd." Elizabeth bit back her reply, but her cheeks flushed. She wasn't new to judgment. As a woman in architecture, she'd faced more than her share. But this felt different. Personal. It felt like people were trying to define who was allowed to belong in their quiet little world. That night, she and Harold sat on the porch beneath the wisteria vines, sipping tea in silence. "Did we make a mistake?" she asked finally. Harold looked at her, eyes clear. "No, but we're asking others to stretch, and not everyone's ready for that." She nodded slowly. The next day, she made a decision. She called the local newsletter editor and asked to publish an open letter. It read, in part, "Our home has always held stories, of childhood, of family dinners, of loss and laughter. Now, it's time for those walls to hold even more. This isn't a center. It's not a facility. It's a living room with wider doors, a kitchen with more chairs, a backyard with room for someone else's memories. We're not giving our house away. We're multiplying its meaning." The letter spread faster than she anticipated. Neighbors she hadn't spoken to in years stopped her on walks. One brought over a quilt to hang in the new lounge. Another offered to help paint. Even Emily called again, this time just to ask what color the front room would be. "Still yellow," Elizabeth said, smiling. "Like always." "Good," Emily replied. "That's home." And in that moment, Elizabeth realized she hadn't lost her home. She was finally letting it breathe. The opening day arrived with the scent of cinnamon and fresh paint still lingering in the air. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, watching as people began to trickle in, slowly at first, then in twos and threes. Neighbors she'd known for decades, faces she didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. A woman with a walker, guided gently by her teenage grandson. A widower from 3 blocks away holding a casserole dish. A retired music teacher with a violin case in hand, eyes glinting with something close to hope. The gray nest, as they had come to call it, was no longer just a sketch or a plan. It was alive. Warm light filtered through the curtains Elizabeth had sewn herself. Soft music played from the corner, where a local jazz trio had volunteered to perform. The fireplace crackled, and the big oak tree outside, still standing strong, cast dancing shadows onto the wooden floor. Elizabeth walked through the room slowly, observing how each space welcomed people in its own way. In the reading corner, 2 elderly women sat side by side, silently flipping through magazines and occasionally nudging each other with quiet laughter. In the kitchen, 3 generations stood around the island counter, learning how to make dumplings from a woman named Mrs. Hahn, who hadn't cooked for anyone but herself in years. In the backyard, a young boy helped an older man tie a ribbon to one of the branches of the oak tree, part of what Harold had coined the memory tree, where anyone could hang a small note, photo, or memento to honor someone they loved. Elizabeth stood beside Harold near the archway that once led to their formal dining room, now transformed into an open gathering space with mismatched chairs and bright artwork. He looked at her, eyes misty. "You did this." She shook her head gently. "We did. Together." Later, as the guests slowly filtered out and dusk settled over the neighborhood, Elizabeth found herself alone in her old studio, now converted into a space called the Archive of Living. She sat in the corner, where her drawing table used to be, now replaced with a large wooden bench and a low bookshelf of photo albums donated by the community. On one of the shelves was a new album bound in linen, titled Beginnings. Inside were photos from today, smiles, hands held, stories told, chairs pulled close, lives intersecting. She ran her hand over the cover and felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Not grief, not regret, just the quiet weight of change. She stood and walked back downstairs where Harold was waiting with 2 cups of tea. They sat on the porch under the wisteria vines, still blooming, still reaching. Across the street, the porch lights of other homes flicked on one by one. "I thought letting go of this place would break me," she said softly. Harold turned toward her. "But it didn't." "No," she said, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "It made room." And as the night deepened and the stars settled above the rooftops, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not nostalgia, not relief, but peace. Because home wasn't what you held on to, it was what you shared. As spring turned to summer, the gray nest settled into a rhythm all its own. Every day brought someone new through its doors. A retired carpenter who now taught woodworking in the garage. A shy widow who started a poetry group in the sunroom. A local teen who came by after school to teach basic tech skills to the elders. and stayed for the chess games. Elizabeth often sat quietly at the edge of it all, watching the life unfold around her. Not managing, not directing, just witnessing. One afternoon, as she pruned the garden beds behind the house, she heard familiar laughter, bright and quick. She looked up to see Emily walking toward her, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder and sunglasses tucked into her hair. "Hey, Mom," Emily said. "Thought I'd drop by early this time." Elizabeth straightened up, smiling. "You picked a good day. It's storytelling hour." They walked inside together, just in time to hear Mr. Jenkins recount the time he got lost in Paris in 1963 with nothing but a dictionary and a baguette. The room was in stitches. Even the usually reserved Mrs. Hahn let out a rare laugh. Afterward, Emily turned to her mother. "I get it now," she said softly. "It's not just a center, it's a living memory." Elizabeth's throat tightened, but she nodded. Emily added, "I think Dad would have loved this." Elizabeth paused. "He does." Emily blinked. "You mean, he's not here?" Elizabeth smiled. "Oh, he's here. In the benches he helped build. In the garden he planted. In every small detail we argued about until it made sense." They stood for a moment, letting the warmth of that truth wrap around them. As the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow through the wide windows, Elizabeth picked up her planner. She had a full week ahead. A grant meeting, a new volunteer orientation, a call from the mayor's office about expanding the Gray Nest model to other neighborhoods. Busy didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like a pulse. That evening, before locking up, Elizabeth walked into her old studio one last time. The shelves were now filled with framed stories, photographs, little clay sculptures from the art class. She knelt beside a shadow box labeled Room 6, First Memory Shared. Inside was a folded paper crane and a note in delicate handwriting. "This place made me feel seen again. Thank you for the light." Elizabeth closed the box gently. She didn't cry, but she felt something settle deep inside her, like a foundation finally cured after a long, patient season. As she stepped out into the evening air, porch light glowing behind her, a thought floated to the surface. She had spent a lifetime building homes, but only now had she built one that could hold the whole world. And she wasn't done yet. Not even close. This story is a powerful reminder that letting go doesn't mean giving up. It can mean expanding your heart. Elizabeth didn't lose her home. She gave it a second life. What did you think of her transformation? Comment 2 if this story touched you, or 7 if it didn't resonate. And if you love emotional and uplifting stories like this, hit like and subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more inspiring content every week.